The topic is what I'm going to call spiritual suffering, and I want to I want to make the argument that humans suffer in a very unique way, and I'm going to call it spiritual suffering. Now, someone might say, well, what you're really talking about is like an imaginative suffering, and it may be something like that, but then we'd have to get into what do we mean by imagination. And the problem is that if you call it imaginative suffering, people will imagine that it's not real. They'll think that they'll sort of downplay the significance or the importance of it, or maybe even what it discloses about the human and the human's relation to the larger cosmos. Okay, so part of the claim here is that animals suffer and animals feel pain to various degrees depending upon the kind of organism that it is, but they don't suffer in the same way that humans suffer. Now, humans suffer arguably in the way that animals do, at least partly, right? We're bodies. We have, all of the physiological apparatus to experience pain. There are forms of suffering, but human suffering can be filled with anxiety, dread, regret, remorse, self-despisal, self-loathing. There's so many dimensions to human forms of suffering that I think we misunderstand part of the problem of human existence if we don't get at what we mean by spiritual suffering. Now, I've said before in other videos, and I've talked about so many of these videos that I feel embarrassed to talk about them, but I don't know if people go back and look at old videos, but I'll see if I can post a link to some of these. Part of the argument would be that humans experience some degree of agency. Now, it's not superlative freedom, it's not something like free will, but it is a degree of agency, and that agency has to do with small capacities for a moment of decision within limited degrees of thinking about options and giving deliberation to those options within particular contexts and backgrounds and histories. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other contingencies, but it has to do with this particular kind of decision making. It has to do with the conspiring of an amplified symbol use, an increasingly amplified sense of imagination, and a depth of memory. And so memory, imagination, and symbol use all conspire, and people live increasingly in their pasts, their historicity, all the ways that new forms of past become possible through memory. I mean, memory is sometimes taken to be subjective, but it's the way nature itself has opened itself to its own past through those organs in the brain that we make memory possible. But memory isn't just something in the organism. I mean, it is, if we look at it reductively, but if we look at it more holistically, we see that nature evolved an organism to be able to represent what had already happened. So in some way, memory is an evolved capacity of organisms' relation to their environment, but organisms are part of the universe as much as the environment is. So it gets very odd. Some of this is wonderful to look at with the issue of mangrove trees, which a lot of people think that mangrove trees grow on islands, but actually mangrove trees grow the islands that they appear to be on. At any rate, it's the way that imagination and symbols and memory really get amplified and developed, and it has to do with the degrees to which, I guess, through lots of forms of technology. So it has to do with literacy, has to do with clocks and mirrors, and all of the degrees to which forms of self-consciousness and explicit self-awareness come in through these different communication technologies that make people feel more or less culpable. And we are able to distinguish between premeditated acts and sort of spontaneous acts of passion. We know someone who's cold and calculatedly deciding to move through a loophole, and someone who, without foresight, makes an accident because they were just not paying attention, or perhaps had made a wrong decision earlier to, drink too much, right? So, and it's the cumulative effect of all of that, right? I think we live in a world that we not only experience various degrees of awakeness and various degrees of conscious explicit awareness, but various degrees of deliberation and choice making within those, and we're aware that other people do the same. And we can make promises to other people. We can get together with other people and make commitments and get ourselves aligned, and then we can know that other people will remember that we made the promise, and they know that we will too. It gets to be intersubjectively created, and it's all of these features which lead to the kind of existential spiritual suffering that the human being can have. Yeah, maybe existential is right, but I do think it's spiritual, and I'm going to get to that more in a second. But so, some person, when they're a certain age, they say to themselves, I'm going to be this kind of a person. And they have this whole notion of what kind of person they're going to be later in life. And, then to various degrees they are or not that person. But it takes a long time for that to really crystallize. But in the meanwhile, as that's crystallizing, they're having, we'll call them little trials, little instances where they make promises, make commitments, and then they either keep those or they fail to keep those. And there's a physical consequence as well as the spiritual import of that meeting or failing to meet what they felt to be their obligation or their commitment. It could be a person decides to get married or not, or they decide to be monogamous or not, right? They get in a relationship, or they decide to have a drink, or they decide not to. They decide to drive after they've been drinking, or they decide not to. A person decides to have kids, right? There's all these different dynamics that, and then they think they're going to be a certain parent, and then they fail to live up to that. It's in the distance between a promise and its keeping that a certain kind of time opens up. And humans have emotions of agony, despair, of accomplishment, of self-satisfaction, of experiencing a trust in oneself, as well as fearing one's own inability to keep one's word. The whole range of experience emotions under spiritual suffering, in existential suffering, they become possible because we're that organism who can aspire, right? Which means that, as Nietzsche would say, that's the animal who could be a hypocrite, right? We can fail, and we're aware of that, and we experience it in a very, a certain depth. So some person, they want to do something with their lives, and I think if they feel as if they haven't lived up to what they set out to, and they increasingly push it from their consciousness, it slowly seeps back in around the back door. It becomes a kind of sickness of the soul, whereas there's a kind of health of the soul that comes from an adherence to what one thinks one ought to do. Now again, this gets very complicated, because there are some people who I think we want to say they have dogmatic commitments to outdated beliefs, and we want to be really careful there. The question is, are they lacking courage? Do they have doubt about their own dogmas? See, some of it has to do with the inner recesses that one has in knowing what one should do or what one shouldn't do. And as I said before, it has to do with memory, imagination, and symbolic capacity. Now, I think animals have limited degrees of these. I mean, clearly animals dream. Certain, animals are aware. I don't know if they're aware of the fact that they've dreamt, but they do. Their bodies sometimes can even be animated during a dream, and so they're responding to some kind of symbolism. It's just not a publicly available, consciously controlled symbolism the way that we have in human discourse and in human movie making and sort of image construction. But I think humans, they feel greater depths over what have they done with their lives, how have they brought justice, equity, fairness, and I think, in some way we haven't really addressed, what it means to, I guess, to be a person who's self-conscious and then can ask the question of how it's related to everything else. Imagination, memory, and symbols, they really make this possible in such an extreme degree. It's like an ultimate sense of what is all of this. And I've heard some people say that life is an imposition. Okay, I'm just going to say for argument right here, right now, even if it is an imposition, which I don't think that's the right word. I think it's just as much a gift as it is an imposition. But at any rate, let's just grant, for the sake of argument, if someone wants to say it's an imposition, it's an utterly forgivable imposition. It's a forgivable imposition. And the question is, what exactly is entailed in coming into being? That to be a person is to not just have a body. It's, to be a person and to suffer personhood, we'll say it is a kind of suffering, it's to first fall into I don't know how many billion-year-old, well-adapted organismal structure. I mean, it's really quite amazing that you get to inherit and just fall into what took billions of years of survival value to accomplish. You just sort of hijack it and appear on the scene. But despite all of that, immune system and all the other complexities, not everyone gets the equal body, but to be a body is to be a clearing for the world, right? It's to have the sunrises and the sunsets as who one is. It's to feel love and to feel beauty for the changing of the seasons. It's to be able to see the stars, to feel all of the different things around one and to see their relations between things. That just comes from having a body. It has nothing to do with one's accomplishment or what one has done, but then we fall back to that, who is one, and is one both a kind of unique self, a self that is caught in promises and commitments and in obligations and in aspirations, versus just all of that which one has as gratis by coming into being, right? I think it is this agony of being self-aware, of being a self-aware organism that it registers the agency by way of the spiritual suffering. And so try to think just, for example, of, have you ever cried to music? I mean, I think most people have cried to music. Now, maybe it's just, really beautiful symphony music. I think sometimes people have composed works of art that are so beautiful they just leave people in tears. I mean, they're just such integrating and then overcoming of tensions. I mean, it's itself an expression of a capacity to feel below the level of words. But within popular music, I think countless people cry on a daily basis. Not each person's crying every day, but if you look across the globe right now, there are people weeping, sobbing to music that touches them in profound ways. It speaks to the agony of their choices, to loves that have been lost, to hopes and to aspirations, to dreams for a better future, to just countless things. And if you take all of that together, if you try to just add all of it and sum it into one instance, the collectively crying, weeping sense of humanity over what it's doing with itself and how able it is to understand its fly in the web-like capacity, that it's trapped in so many ways and yet has agency in so many other ways, at least to limited degrees, that in their cumulative effect have so many consequences. Now, I think traditionally people have had recourse to imagining the afterlife. And the ability to imagine the afterlife and to symbolize it has arguably been one of the greatest riches that everyone could share. So, even though life is cruel and unjust in distributing differences, among people being naturally healthy and other people just being naturally sickly, and that's just a fact. But then we have added to that social injustices, which I think people realize are much more under control. Are they completely under control? I don't know. Social dynamics get very complicated. Complex social systems take on a life of their own, and individuals, their behavior is oftentimes more predicted by environmental factors than by things inside them. It gets to be a very complex phenomena, and yet they can make meta-level strategies to try to deal with that. Right? There's this whole question of how one deliberates at what level over what one can do. But traditionally, as I say, religious belief in the afterlife, belief that there will be ultimate justice, ultimate equality, perfection in some sense. I personally, I don't believe in the afterlife. I think it was a beautiful thought, and I'm not suggesting that people can't enjoy their ability to imagine it, and it may be wonderful to imagine it. My grandfather was severely disabled, and he lived his life with, one arm that was kind of cut off at the, like, little over the elbow, and had like a stump with a little thumb there. We called it Andy, when I was a kid. And he had one leg a little below the knee and one leg above the knee. And he was born this way, and, he lived with early artificial limbs. I mean, before people really used such things, and then he, sort of got rid of the one on his hand. But, he walked around, and I remember when I was a little kid, I would ask my parents or my grandparents, when Grandpa's in heaven, will he have his body, or will he have, a regular body? And, I don't think people knew what to say. I think sometimes they would say, well, no, he'll have a normal body. And I'd be, well, what's wrong with his body? And I think sometimes they'd say, well, in heaven, he'll just have the way his body always was, but it won't matter. Everyone will it will just accept it. And, I think it's funny, are there going to be computers in heaven? Again, I think if there are computers in heaven, you're probably in hell. The person who's having all of these virgins in their heaven, are these actual virgins? Did they have to die at virginity? Are they fake people? Does the person know that they're fake? I mean, when you start to ask questions about it, maybe it starts to break down. But maybe it starts to move also toward the other kind of existential anxiety and the spiritual suffering. I mean, I think the spiritual suffering has moved from individual despair, individual self-loathing, and the failure of a person who thinks that their life was not what they thought it was going to be. I think it's moving increasingly to a spiritual sickness across the society, and hopefully not the globe, but maybe the globe. It's a collective resignation to the fact that people think that they're failing themselves. And maybe the question is, can we imagine? Can we use our memory? Can we use all the symbolic edifice at our resource right here to imagine a more just world right here? I don't know if there's no life after death. I don't think that there is. But I think the more that people imagine that there is, the less they feel obligated to bring about justice, a more equitable world here. I think they're easy to just overlook all the problems that we're facing. We're not ever going to be able to remove all of the world's problems, all of the world's suffering. But I think we can try to minimize the suffering, and I think people have, they've made various strides toward it. But one of the things would be to recognize the degree to which, even if it's very limited, that we do have agency, and then to see, can't we try to start managing this spiritual, existential suffering that's been spread throughout individuals and increasingly throughout the society. All right, some thoughts of the day. Hope everyone is well. Thanks.